looked at how the Passover is a type and a shadow of Jesus, and Jesus is our Passover, that in Him we find protection. In Him we find that the punishment of sin has been dealt with, and we saw how Israel, the nation of Israel, was imprisoned, and God wanted to lead the nation of Israel out into freedom, and how we as people, God's people, are called to be free and not bound. And in the same way the Israelite nation was led out, was released by the power of God and power of the blood of a blameless lamb, we are set into freedom in the same way by Jesus Christ. And so you and I are meant to live in freedom. We are not meant to live in bondage. And one of the places where God is calling us to freedom is in our minds. Right? So you and I can be bound in our minds. That's what scarcity really is. And scarcity is not just about material things, scarcity of joy. Right? How you experience life. People that have a scarcity mindset are always complaining about something. Have you ever noticed that? Nothing is ever good. There's no ever joy in their lives. People that have scarcity mindsets are always complaining about something. Now, it doesn't mean that if you have an abundance kind of outlook in life that you're not going to go through difficult things. Of course you are. But your response to those things will be different. How you respond to those things will be different. And your response will often look like this. Man, this sucks. What do I need to learn here? Because every opportunity is a learning and a growth opportunity. And so God will lead you in times of difficulty and trial, because what He's trying to do is trying to develop something on the inside of you. He's trying to grow you. We are being matured unto Christ likeness. Growth, another word for growth is maturity. A process of maturity. So God is trying to get you and me to a place where we are mature in the things of God. And God will often put you in a situation where He's going to reveal really what's within your heart. Out of the heart, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And so if you are hearing people constantly complain, or if you are someone that's constantly complaining, well, you know now where your heart is at. And see, this is the wonderful thing, because God wants to circumcise your heart, and so He can change that heart, because He said, guard your heart with all diligence, for out of it flow the issues of life. It's got nothing to do with what I want to preach about this morning. But God wants us to be free. And a lot of times we are bound not because of external things, but we bind ourselves within our minds as a response to the external things. That's why two people can go through exactly the same thing, go through exactly the same scenario. They can be in exactly the same situation. One will have one response, and another will have a different response. One will get stuck there, another one will move forward. And so God, as we're looking through these Old Testament accounts, I want you to understand that this is we're not just looking at history. Even though this is a historical book, we are not just looking at history, but we're looking at how do we look at, and how is this a type and a shadow of what God does in our own lives. Right? How Christ is the Passover, and how in Him we live, move, and have our being. We are safe in Him. Right? And so this morning I want to carry on, and really this morning I've entitled it The Wilderness Way. The Wilderness Way. And the big idea this morning of this morning's message is that oftentimes God's greatest expression is seen in the wilderness. Oftentimes we see God's greatest expression of who He is in our lives in the wilderness. Now, what is a wilderness? A wilderness, if you talk about how does that apply in my life, a wilderness is a season or period in your life where things are dry, where things are a little bit confusing, where things are a little bit difficult, where things are a little bit challenging, where things aren't flowing as easily as what you think they should. I want you to understand that you do not go from bondage into the promised land. What is the promised land in your life? Whatever God has put on your life, the vision, the promise of your life, that's your promised land. The promises of God is a promised land in our lives. You do not go from Egypt into the promised land. You go from Egypt into a wilderness period to the promised land. Because here's the thing, God takes Israel out of Egypt. We'll see now. But He also needs to take Egypt out of Israel. See, God takes you out of Egypt. What is Egypt? Egypt is a type and a shadow or a picture of bondage. Right? And so God takes you out of bondage, but guess what? You are carrying, like Israel, 400 years of enslavement mentality. And so even though God takes you out of Egypt, takes you out of slavery, takes you out of bondage, guess what? He still needs to take Egypt out of you. Because we learn things. You don't just wake up one day and say, oh, I'm free. Like we'll see now. Oh, I'm free. This is wonderful. Freedom. And then you just know. No. You are free, but you still have some bondage within yourself that you need to break down, release, and let go. And so God takes you and me through a wilderness period, not because He doesn't like us. Not because He's got nothing better to do. Not because He's forgotten about us. He takes us through a wilderness period because He's saying, look, I need you to unlearn some things so that you can learn some new things. So when you come into your promised land, which is full of opposition, you actually have the character that's built up to drive out the inhabitants and possess the thing that that have called you to. But a lot of times we just want to go from here, jump over the line, I'm bound, I'm free, this is easy, this is wonderful. And you have to know that God is more concerned about your character than what He's concerned about your comfort. I don't like that. I don't like saying that because it's not nice. It's not nice saying stuff like that. We just want to say, God, God's going to do it. Tomorrow, I'm just sensing by the Spirit. By the end of this week, type amen. And it doesn't work like that. And you know, the thing is, some things take longer. Sometimes it takes a long time to see the thing come to fruition in your life. But that's why it's not about the thing that God is taking you, but about Him. It's not about where He wants you to end up. It's about the journey with Him. And so God wants that relationship to be strong first before He takes you to where He wants you to be. So here's the thing, as we're going to see. I've found that even as we look at the account of Israel going through the wilderness, that God's greatest expression of who He is, the power of God, the miracles of God, happen in the wilderness. And so in your wilderness period, and this is what I've seen in my own life, is that in God we see God's expression of who He is, the highest expression of His power and His grace and His mercy and His favor. We see it most of the time in those wilderness periods, those dry periods. And I wonder why. Is it that God is more active in the wilderness? I don't think so. I just think that we are more in search of Him because we are people and we're human. We only go to God when it's not nice going, we get comfortable when it's comfortable. And then things aren't going like, oh, let me go to God because things aren't working out is what they think. And then we go there. And so I think sometimes it's that intentionality that produces the thing in our lives more often than what it is just God being more active. Because I don't think it's God being more active. Is there a feed? Maybe I'm just shouting too much. I'm hearing something. Lord, is that you? I'm here. Speak, for your servant listens. So we find God's greatest expression in the wilderness oftentimes. Okay, so we're going to pick up from Exodus 13. And it says, and then it came to pass when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God did not lead them by the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest perhaps the people change their minds when they see war and return to God, or they return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea. And the children of Israel went up in orderly ranks out into the land of Egypt. So we find that now the Egyptians are basically chasing Israel out, right? They're like, please, we don't want you, right? This is crazy because they were in bondage. They were literally slaves to Egypt, and all of a sudden, because of God's power, and God comes against with the 10 plagues, comes against the deities, I learned last week, the deities of the Egyptians, it causes chaos in Egypt. And the Egyptians, the slave masters are literally saying to the slaves, please leave. We don't want you around anymore. And so they go out and they carry out all of them. None were feeble. And they carry actually the wealth of Egypt out of them. So they plunder Egypt. And they get out and say, thank you very much. This is payback for 400 years. Restitution. We on our way. And now God is basically saying to them, now when you go out of Egypt, I'm not going to lead you by the way of the Philistines. It was a nearer route. Where God needed them to take to was in what would seem as an easier or nearer route. The direct route. God says, I'm not going to lead you that way. Why? Because that route was actually filled with military outposts, and it was actually a dangerous route. So God says, number one, I'm not going to lead you there because I'm still trying to protect you because you've been a slave for 400 years. You don't know how to fight. You're not going to just walk out of there. There's going to be opposition because even though Pharaoh let you go, there's people along the way that haven't got the message. Now they see 600,000 people walking, they're going to fight you. And you've been a slave for 400 years. You have no idea how to fight. You have no idea what's a sword. You've been shackled. You don't know how to give orders because you've only been taking orders for 400 years. You don't know how to lead. You don't know anything. You're a baby, basically. And so I'm going to lead you by a longer route, but I'm going to lead you by a safer route. Okay? And so God says, look, I'm not going to take them through dangerous route because the moment they see opposition, they're going to turn around and go back. And so a lot of times what God doesn't allow us to do is go from a place of bondage to an immediate place of victory because God knows, listen, there's certain things that you've taken on in your time of slavery that you don't know how to fight. And you're going to still face some opposition. And if I leave you there, you're going to turn around and say, this is too hard, let me just go back to where I was. It's too hard. It's too hard to fight. I have no idea what's happening. Let me go back to what I know. And a lot of times we return to what we know because it's easier. But we're not allowing God to take us to what's better because it's uncomfortable and unfamiliar. And so God, to save us from danger and subsequent discouragement, God often leads us by a safer, albeit longer route. So sometimes what God wants to do in your life takes a little bit longer. Why? Because it's a little bit safer. Because He's trying to protect you. Because He knows, number one, you're going to come against opposition. And number two, so either it's going to be harmful for you, or number two, you're just going to get discouraged. And you're going to be like, this sucks. I'm going back. This is stupid. Why would I subject myself to this? So God takes a little bit longer, right, to take you because He needs to rework some things in your life. Because in this time of reworking it, He needs to keep you a little bit safe. Right? All right, and so we see that God takes them into a different route. And here's once again, remember when we did Genesis, when Joseph they stayed in Egypt and Joseph wasn't buried, he was in a coffin. And there was a proclamation from Joseph to say, when you get out of here, take my bones with you. And see, we see the fulfillment of God's promise. I wanted to add this because it's the faithfulness to God's covenant. So God proclaims, I'm going to take you out of here, but it's going to be a little while. And so Joseph, what the bones were actually doing is declaring the promise of God to the Israel nation that I am faithful and it will still come to pass. And we see Moses taking the bones of Joseph with them as they leave. And so we jump to verse 20. It says, and so they took their journey from Succoth and camped in Etham at the edge of the wilderness. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so as to go by day and by night. And He did not take away the pillar of cloud by day or the pillar of fire by night from before the people. Why is this important? So God leads Israel by a cloud during the day and fire by night. Okay. So what is that a picture of? Is that God moves and we need to move with Him. There's a cloud that moves and we need to move with the cloud. There's a fire that moves and we need to move with it. And so during the day, the cloud provides protection, and during night, the fire provides protection, but also provides direction. And so when you come out of Egypt, guess what's going to happen? It's going to be dry, hot, and dark. But it says, ESCOM. Cold, no hot water, dark, no electricity. And it says He did not take away the pillar. So God, even in the midst of the wilderness, by the way, God led Israel into the wilderness. We often miss this part. Because oftentimes we go into our own wilderness and we want to rebuke the devil. Because anything that's uncomfortable must be from the devil. Anything that is not rosy, peachy, and smelling like roses must not be from God. So it must be the devil. So let's rebuke, and nothing's happening. Guess what? Because every time you see God taking anyone into the wilderness, it was by the Spirit of God. And so in your wilderness period, you need to understand that God's actually led you there. But He says, I'm going to lead you, I'm going to show you the way, I'm going to protect you, I'm going to show you the light, and more importantly, I'm not going to take it away. See, in the same way that Israel is led through by the cloud of a pillar of fire, right? And the cloud, Israel was assured of God's continual presence. And in the same way, you and I are assured of His continual presence in every season of our life. So you go through wilderness period, He leads you, He guides you, but it's also a sign that He does not leave you. You're not there on your own. Even though sometimes it does feel like it, because the wilderness period has this tendency to make you think you're the only one going through it. Right? Have you ever felt like that? Ever felt like you're the only one that's going through this thing? You're the only one in the world that's going through this thing in your life. And so, unfortunately, if you're not careful, you're going to succumb to the temptation of the wilderness period, because it's a testing ground. It's a testing period. But God says, if you will move with me when I move with you, you will stop when I stop, you will be protected. Because guess what? If Israel did not stop when the pillar of fire moved, they would be in the dark. They would be cold. If they went ahead, same thing. During the day, if they didn't move with the cloud, if they tried to go ahead without the cloud moving, they would die of heat. And so cloud provides protection, and so it's the same picture for us. In our wilderness period, when God is trying to take Egypt out of us, trying to take that bondage out of us, God says, I want you to follow me closely. I'm going to show you where to go, but when I go, you got to go. And you need to be in sync and in step with me. You can't be like, oh, all right, cool, it's fine, we'll catch up to you. Because God doesn't stop. See, we need to understand that God moves. And He says, I move and I love you, but you gotta stay close. You need to stay here. You know, it's just a picture of, you know, when dogs are well trained. I'm not saying we're dogs, I'm just saying the picture is, it stays close. Right? Stays close. The owner goes somewhere, it stays. And that's the picture that we need to have with God. We got to stay close to God, because when God says go, you got to go. And when He says stop, you need to stop. You can't go ahead of Him, because that's even as worse as not going with Him. Sometimes we go ahead of God and we try to do things our own strength. I'm going through a wilderness period, so let me quickly fix it because I know what to do. And sometimes, yes, that is the case, because there's a wisdom that God gives you, that God gives you a direction. And yes, you can make a decision quickly. But make sure it's the right decision. Don't be led by emotion. Don't be led by hype. Don't be led by either high emotion or low emotion. Oh, I'm so anxious. Oh, I'm so depressed. Oh, this sucks. Or like, oh God, this is going so well. Let's just go. We need to be led of the Spirit of God. the sons of God led of the Spirit of God. So this is a type and a picture of Israel being led by the Spirit of God, because this is God leading them, the Spirit of God leading them. All right, and we jump to chapter 14. And when Pharaoh drew near, the children of Israel lifted their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them. It's like they wouldn't have learned after 10 plagues. They're like, no, we're still going to go after them. We first chase you out, then we're still going to come after you. What does that mean? That sometimes in your wilderness period, the things that you left behind are still going to be there. I don't know if you've ever experienced this. I often experience it. It's because I'm human. Is that the things that I thought I dealt with years ago, all of a sudden start cropping up again. It's like, did you not learn? Me and God are good. Like, can you leave me alone? Right? And so sometimes what's going to happen is the very thing that you think you've been freed from is going to come after you again. Right? Jesus speaks about, he says, when you, and he speaks about, demons, etc. And he says, when you drive out the demons from the house and you sweep it up, they come back because it's an empty house. So make sure when you find freedom from whatever it is that's keeping you on bondage, don't leave it empty, because the void is just going to be filled with that thing. Make sure when you find freedom from that thing, that you actually fill it with something else, the Spirit of God, so that there's no room for that thing to come through, and shut that door. Don't keep the door open. Right? And so now the Egyptians come after Israel. And they were very afraid, and the children of Israel cried out to the Lord. Did the right thing. See, they did the right thing. God takes them out, and they don't go out, we got this. We showed those Egyptians. Nothing can come. They don't get prideful. And they don't forget the one that actually brought them out of bondage. So they see Egyptians coming out, and they're like, okay, they're coming after us. So instead of us trying to fight them, we're just going to go back to the person that knows how to handle them. Yeah. God Himself. And so to do the right thing, we see that Israel cries out to the Lord. And then they give Moses attitude. And then they said to Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, have you taken us away to die in the wilderness? I mean, we can be really fickle. Why have you so dealt with us to bring us up out of Egypt? So they're basically saying to Moses, we could have just died in Egypt. Were there no graves there? Because we're going to die now. So did you just bring us out because there were no graves? They were giving Moses a real attitude. By the way, this is the same guy that goes to Pharaoh, and there's all these plagues, and there's all these miracles, and the moment they're out of there, they go, so what now? It's really and this is what we often do, is that we kind of, God, why did you even take me out of there? Why did you bring me? This is so much worse. You could have just left me. Why do you bring me out of there? And now, that's how we are. We have very short memories. And that's part of that scarcity bondage thing, where we like, God needs to take that out of us so we can actually recognize who He is. Okay. I mean, it wasn't even a week out of Egypt. They weren't even a week out of there. And they'd forgotten, they'd already distorted the past. They'd already forgotten what God had done in their lives. Verse 12 says, is this not the word that we told you in Egypt, saying, let us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? I mean, for it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than for us to die in the wilderness. It's been a week and they've already distorted what just happened. He just said, did we not tell you must just leave us in Egypt? Did we not tell you must leave us in Egypt? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians. But here's what we need to do. When we find ourselves in dangerous places, because what is that? That is a response. That is a response of fear, isn't it? What is fear? Fear is faith in the wrong thing. That's all fear is. Fear is faith in the wrong thing. When I'm fearful, I'm putting my faith in something that is not God. And so when I come out of there and I see, oh my word, it's coming up again. I just dealt with it. God, what are you doing? Why are you taking me here? I need to remind myself what God did, and I need to remind myself of who God is. Because I'm finding myself in a dangerous place. I'm fearful. I'm scared. I don't know what's going to happen. And so I'm lashing out. Isn't it? It's because we haven't built up our faith. It's just our faith hasn't been built up. We haven't built up the muscle. And so we're lashing out and we're trying to find reasons and an outlet for our fear. So the first place we go is we put blame. We start blaming. Moses, it's all your fault. It's all your fault. Whatever, 10 plagues, whatever, who cares? The Passover lamb, who cares about that? I'm in the here and now and I'm afraid. And it's your fault. But we need to learn to change our response. And so when we find ourselves in a dangerous place, we need to cry out to God. When we find ourselves in a dangerous place and where there seems to be no escape, we need to actually be crying out to God. And Moses said to them, verse 13, Moses said to the people, do not be afraid, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which He will accomplish for you today. Do not be afraid. I forget the number, but I don't know. I think there's about 300 or 400 times throughout the word that statement says, "Do not be afraid." God speaking to His people. Do you know what I think He's actually saying by "Do not be afraid"? Do not be afraid. He's repeating it like hundreds of times. Why? Why is He saying to you, number one, you and I are going to be afraid. But number two, the only time somebody says to you, do not be afraid, is because they know there's nothing to be afraid of. And so God says to him, do not be afraid, stand still. Don't run ahead. Don't try to do something in your own strength. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. You're not going to feel it. You're not going to maybe it happen. You're actually going to see God come through for you today. Well, maybe not today, but He's going to accomplish it in the near future. That's my disclaimer. And you're going to come to me, you said today. I'm like, He says, do not be afraid. At this point, Moses had no idea of how God is going to move in the situation. God doesn't tell Moses, okay, now listen, Moses, don't be afraid because I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, 4. And that's what we want, right? We want the whole plan. God, what are you going to do? And don't worry, Bojan, listen, just take it, calm down. Don't be afraid. This is exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to do this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and this is exactly how it's going to end. It doesn't say that. At this point, Moses has no idea what's going to happen. He's got the Israelites, might as well be Egyptians, Israelites moaning at him. He's got the Egyptians coming after him. And he's like, God, a little help here. And God says to him, or rather Moses says to the people by the Spirit of God, do not be afraid, stand still. See the salvation of the Lord, for He will accomplish for you today. He has no idea what's going to happen. But he has faith enough to declare that God is going to do something. Because this is not God speaking to Moses. This is Moses speaking to the people before he's even spoken to God. He sees the Egyptians, the Israelites moan at him, and he goes and says, right, don't moan at me because I have a plan. What's your plan? I got God. That's my plan. Well, what's God's plan? I have no idea. But what I do know is that He's going to do something. I just don't know what He's going to do. Why? Because a week ago I saw Him do something out of nothing. So I've seen Him, I've walked enough with Him, a little bit longer than some of you, and I've seen certain things. So all I want you to do is calm down. Calm yourself. Bring yourself to yourself. Take a breath. Sit down. Calm down, because we're going to see God do something. We don't know what it is, but God's going to do something. Because they were in such a bad situation that he knew God had to do something. Right? And he says to the Israelites, he says, I want you to stand still. And oftentimes this is God's direction for us. in times of crisis. Oftentimes, the God's direction for us is stand still. You see, because we can be fish out of water. We can have a lot of activity and be dying. We're using up all this energy. And God just says, I want you to stand still. Be still and know that I am God. I want you to stand still and see the salvation. Why? Because despair casts us down. It keeps us from standing. Fear will tell you to retreat. Because that's exactly what they wanted to do. We're afraid, let's go back. You see, fear causes us to shrink back. But faith says, no, you need to go forward. Right? Whether that's go forward now or whatever God is saying, we need to be careful that we don't allow fear to cause us to shrink back and retreat back to where we were. Because if God is calling you out of something, He's calling you out of it by faith. And you and I have to step out in faith. Amen. Impatience will tell you to do something now. Oh man. So one of our biggest enemies is impatience. Can't wait. I can't wait. I need an answer now. I need an answer now. You got to come through now. Yes, and sometimes we cause our own problems and then we need God to come through now, and God's like, but I never told you to do that. So don't place your crisis on me when I never told you to do that thing. Not all the time, I'm just saying. So impatience will tell you to do something now. Presumption will tell you to jump into the Red Sea before it's been opened. And He says, stand still, the Lord will fight for you and you shall hold your peace. What does it mean to hold? You got to hold on to your peace. Peace is not something that you find. Peace is something that you decide and create. Let's say would create. It's not a place you get to. It's something that you encounter and you find in the midst of what you're going through. So He says, Lord will fight for you and you got to hold your peace. Hold your peace. Count it all joy in the midst of tribulation. Right? As God told Israel, He often tells us to simply stand and hold our peace as He reveals His plan. Because you're going to find now what God is actually going to do. He's going to actually tell Moses what to do. But if Moses and the Israelites actually went back to Egypt, God can't reveal His plan. If they go ahead of God, you're going ahead of me, you don't want part of my plan. So God often tells us, this is what often God tells us, He says, I want you to stand still, I want you to see and hold your peace as I reveal, as I show you what needs to be done in this wilderness period. And I find it amazing. Just look at this progression. I know it's sometimes a little bit difficult because I'm going verse by verse. But the progression is Moses declares God will do something. Moses says, listen, watch verse 13. Do not be afraid. He has no idea what God is going to do. He hasn't spoken to God. God hasn't told him anything. And what he's doing by faith, he's going to these Israel and said, listen guys, fake it till you make it. Don't be afraid, guys. Just stand still. God's got this thing. Right? You got this thing, because I'm saying things I don't even know what's happening. But he's taking a step of faith and declaring something, saying those things that are not as though they are. Even though it is that He will fight for you. Right? Speaking certain things, declaring certain things, going out in faith, not waiting for the thing to happen to say, whew, okay. No, stepping out in faith, saying God is going to do something. I don't know what He's going to do, but I'm going to stand still until He tells me to do something. I want to see the salvation of the Lord. And the word salvation means wholeness, every area of your life being brought into wholeness, and He will accomplish it for you today. He will fight for you, He says, and you shall hold your peace. He still has not heard from God. But he's declaring some things because he knows something is going to happen. It's not allowing fear to cause him to retreat, but is allowing his faith to rise up to advance. Even though he's standing still, spiritually he's advancing because he's saying God's going to fight for you. And then verse 15, literally the next verse, it says, and the Lord said to Moses. Verse 14, hold your peace. God's going to fight with you. God hasn't spoken to him yet. Verse 15, and the Lord said to Moses. See, God responds to our advancement in faith. God responds to us standing close to him, saying, God, I know you're going to do something, I just don't know. So I'm going to stand still, I'm going to hold my peace until you reveal to me what the plan is. Because I know you have a plan, I just don't want to know what it is yet. So the Lord says, why are you crying to me? God's getting irritated. Tell the people to go forward. Okay, where are we going to? Tell the people to go forward. It does not say tell the people to go forward, X, Y, Z. It says tell the people to go forward. Why are you stopping? I never told you to stop. Go forward. Now he says, now I want you to lift up your rod and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it. Okay? Lift up your rod over the sea and divide it. Okay? How is that going to work? Lift up your rod over the sea and divide it. But God, I just need to understand, what angle do I hold it here? Do I point it? Do I say, just give me like a little, like, lift up your rod over the sea and divide it. But I just need to understand how to do that. Like how, okay, so I'm going to go, do I go to the sea? Do I stand at the sea? Do I speak at the sea? Like how, do I point at it? Do I hold it up? Are you going to, is there like a lightning bolt? And what do you mean divide it? Like what? Lift up your rod, stretch your hand over the sea and divide it. And the children of Israel shall go on dry land through the midst of the sea. But I'm just trying to understand, like, look, I know you can do really cool stuff, but I just need to know what I need to tell them, right? It's not for me, right? I've got faith. You don't need to tell me. I just need to know what I need to tell the people, right? So it's not about me, right? That's what we do. Imagine, like, God's like, all right, so I want you to go to the Red Sea, and I just want you to stick your stick out and divide it. And then once you divide it, the people are going to go walk through the dry land. And Moses is like, oh, okay, cool, let's go do this. Fine, it's fine, it's fine, it's no problem. And indeed, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, and they shall follow them. So I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over all his enemies, his chariots and his horsemen. Then the Egyptians shall know that I am, once again, I am the Lord. God's like, if you don't know by now, man, let me tell you again. When I've gained honor for myself over Pharaoh, his chariots and his horsemen. God tells Moses to do a very simple action. It was not complicated. He says, lift up your rod. It's not complicated. It's just weird. It's just something that we don't understand. But it's a simple action. Pick up your rod. Okay, I've picked up the rod. You don't have to fast for 5 hours. You don't have to dance around the Red Sea. You don't have to, just pick up your rod. It was a simple instruction, but it required obedience. Because sometimes the simplest things, it's like weird. The simplest things need the greatest faith. Because we want it complicated. We need it fancy. God just says, no, just calm down, stand still. Let me reveal my plan. What's the plan? Sure, we're going to counteract them, and you're going to give me superpowers, and they're going to come, and we're going to go whoosh, and they're all going to die. He's like, no, just lift up your rod. Okay, well, that's unexciting. That's anticlimactic. Right? Because our greatest miracles of salvation happen with simple actions on our part. Obedience is simple. It's not easy, but it's simple. Obedience is challenging, but it's simple. And oftentimes our greatest miracles of salvation, our greatest breakthroughs are seen in simple actions on our part. When God says, go talk to that person, but I don't want to go talk to them. Go talk to them. What am I going to say to them? Just go talk to them. I must actually share this one sermon I was listening to, Chris Valentin, and he's talking about faith, radical faith, and how early in his walk, God told him to start a business. And he's like, but I want to be in ministry. And he says, but to go start a business. But I want to be in ministry. He says, I want you to start a business. He says, but I have no money. Okay, I didn't ask you how much money you had. I said, go start a business. And he tells Chris Valentin, go see this guy. What must I say to him? Just go see him. Right? And I'll share it in the groups, but the point of the story was that oftentimes that he was arguing with God because God wasn't telling him, and he was arguing. Says, he tells him, "I'm starting a business." Okay, great. And he's like, "But I've got no money. So what do you want?" Well, I want your money. And how God works through just changing people's hearts, but it requires simple obedience. It requires God told me to come and tell you I'm starting a business and I need space. Oh, but I don't have money to pay for the rent. Well, then why are you here? Well, I don't know. God told me to come here. He says I'm going to speak to you. Okay, fine. You can have you. And the story goes, he gives the space rent free for a year. I'm going a little bit off track, but the point is that oftentimes the things that produce the greatest breakthrough in our lives are the simplest acts of obedience. We underestimate what God can do in our lives through small steps of obedience. We underestimate. We always think it's this big stuff. But the small things of obedience is actually what brings the greatest breakthrough. Come, let's wrap up this morning. And the angel of God went before the camp of Israel, moved behind them, and the pillar of cloud went from before them and stood behind them. So now all of a sudden the cloud's gone from in front of them to be between them to make a separation between Israel and the Egyptians. Right? And so it came between the camp of Egyptians and the camp of Israel. Thus it was a cloud and darkness to one, and it gave light by night to the other. And it's amazing how God, the glory of God and the work of God can be light to one person and seem dark to other people. Sometimes, you see, because what it did was this cloud created darkness for the Egyptians but created light for Israel. And oftentimes, we'll have there can be two people, and then we can experience the same thing, experience the glory of God, the work of God, and it became darkness to one and light to the other. In the same way, in our own personal lives as Christians, the message of the cross, 1 Corinthians 1:18 says, the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. It's darkness to those that are perishing. But to those who are being saved, it is the power of God. The message of the cross is power of God to those that are being saved, those that are in Christ. Verse 21, the last verse here, as I close. And then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. So Moses didn't know how it was going to be done. All he needed to know was what he needed to do. He said, listen, I want you to stretch out your rod and just let them walk on dry ground. What dry ground? It's a sea. There is no dry ground. It required Moses to be obedient in the simple action. Okay, God said I must do this. Okay, there's 600,000 people watching what you're going to do. Shazam. I don't know. What do we say? It says, and he stretched out his hand, and God did what? He backed up the instruction. And he causes the Red Sea to be parted. So the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on the dry ground, and the waters were walls, like walls next to them. On their right hand, on their left hand. And they, look at these, almost said something very rude, but look at these very smart Egyptians. And the Egyptians pursued them and went after them into the midst of the sea. All the Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and all his horsemen. Now it came to pass in the morning watch that the Lord looked down upon the army of Egyptians through the pillar of the cloud, and he troubled the army of the Egyptians. And he took off their chariot wheels, so they drove them into difficulty. And the Egyptians said, let us flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fights for them against Egypt. And the Lord said to Moses, stretch now. He says, now the waters are still receded, right? There's still wall. The Egyptians are chasing after them on the dry ground. And God says, let's close up that sea. And the Lord said to Moses, now stretch your hand over the sea that the waters may come upon the Egyptians on their chariots and on their horsemen. At this point, they're still not saved. Because all God has done is provided a path through the Red Sea, and the Egyptians are still coming. And so God says to Moses, now stretch your hand out again. And as Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and when the morning appeared, the sea returned to its full depth, while the Egyptians were fleeing into it. So the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. Then the waters returned and covered the chariots, the horsemen, and all of the army of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them. Not so much as one of them remained. He covered everything. It was total salvation. There was nothing left behind. He says, now when I free you and I come against the thing that's still chasing you, I'm going to do a complete work. It's going to be finished. Jesus says, it's finished. What does it mean? When He says it's finished, He says, I've done a complete work. You don't add to it. You don't take it away. It's done. There's nothing more to be done. And so when God takes away the Egyptians, saying, listen, I want to make sure that you understand, not so much as one of them has remained. Nothing that is holding you, nothing that's keeping you in bondage is left over. You see, God could have performed this miracle without Moses' cooperation. He could have done it. God didn't need Moses. He could have done it without him. But in the same way, God often uses people to take part in His miraculous works. What does that mean? It's that partnership. See, God wants to move in your life, but He wants you to partner with Him. He needs to use you in your own life. And also He needs to use you in somebody else's life. And so we see that God often uses us and people in His actual works, in His miraculous works. And so the question then becomes in our own lives, how many miraculous works of God have not been done because no person has stepped up to be the one who will stretch out their hand? Just think about that. How many miraculous works in your life and my life have not been performed because we didn't step up and stretch out a hand in simple obedience? And we are still struggling with the Egyptians chasing us. Still struggling with the things that kept us in bondage because we weren't willing to step up and stretch out a hand. We weren't willing to be participants in God's miraculous works. How many things in your own life and how many things in other people's lives? Other people's lives, miracles that have not been performed because we weren't willing to stretch out our hands. The last verse says, so the Lord saved Israel out of the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. I wonder why God made sure that. See, God wants you and me to know that everything that has been holding us in bondage is dead, and He needs us to see the evidence of it. See, God could have just drowned them and just let the bodies float to the bottom of the Red Sea. But for some reason, God says, no, I want you to see that your oppressor is dead. Because oppressed people are slow to believe they are free while their tyrants still live. You see, if you still have things in your lives that you have not seen that are dead, you're still going to be in bondage. You and I are still going to be in bondage. Now, I'm not saying the people in your life need to die. Okay, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the things that are holding you in bondage. You and I will always find ourselves struggling unless we see that our oppressor is dead. In the same way, through the pressure of our trial is almost unbearable, you and I will see our Egyptians dead. You will see it. But it's going to require obedience. It's going to require the simple act of obedience. The seemingly insignificant act of obedience of stretching out your hand, whatever that means in your life, whatever God's saying to you in your life, stretching out your hand so you can see the miracle power of work. Miracle, working power in your life.